Hello, friend. Welcome back to Becoming. My name is Nick Slater. Today on the show, we're joined by an intimacy coach, Chloe Mascord. And this whole episode is basically one big free session with Chloe, where she kindly coaches us through some of the more common issues she faces with her clients, including how to boost your libido and reclaim your sexual power, how to navigate these sensitive topics with your partner around sex and sex expectations, what to do if your partner doesn't want sex, the value of organizing a sex date with your partner and how that looks, and the very specific tool you can use to boost your sexual libido in the bedroom. Now, I learned so much from this episode, and I hope you do as well. You can find more of Chloe on her own podcast, Honey Ed, or at honey-ed.com. And I've just realized there's a bunch of people listening and watching who haven't yet subscribed. Now, this is an entirely self-funded operation, and your support helps me keep the lights on. So if you found value in a few episodes, kindly consider hitting that subscribe button. Now, I'll jump out of the way because this is a great episode. Enjoy Chloe Mascord. Chloe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to have a chat with you today.
So a few years ago, you were struggling with low libido yourself, which as a intimacy coach, I'm sure felt a little off-brand. Did that experience, though, give you insight that you're able to then pass on to your clients?
As much, to my dismay, as much as I would have loved to have not had to go through it myself, I think it was also a really profound lesson, and navigating a dynamic where I was experiencing the low libido, but also being in another relationship where my partner had also experienced low libido, added this layer of, complexity, but learning as well. And I think it's really important to see both sides of the same coin and understanding the internal struggles that we go through with low libido, but also the relational impacts as well.
Well, through that experience, were you able to diagnose or work out what was causing it for you?
I think when we're talking about low libido, it can stem from a variety of different places. And I feel if we look at it like as human beings, we're all really unique in our own personalities and our thoughts and our triggers and the sensitivities that we have. When I look at low libido, and I use this for myself as well, when we're breaking it down, we can put it into categories, which gives us an understanding and the ability to address it more effectively. And the categories that I'll often see in my clients is whether it be physical, emotional, lifestyle, or psychological. Each of these factors can really overlap into different categories, and there's a real fine line between each. But I'd love to go into a little bit more detail with you, and then obviously I can share my experience as well.
Yes, please.
So when we're talking about physical, we're talking about things like hormonal imbalances like low testosterone, estrogen, thyroid issues, hormone issues that can impact sexual desire. We're also talking about things like medication, chronic health complications, fatigue, alcohol and substance abuse. When we're talking about moderate alcohol use, that might enhance sexual desire, but excessive use can dampen libido. So they're the kind of physical reasons for low libido. And then we've got emotional, which would be stress and anxiety, which is super common, in particular with clients that I speak to. Depression, relationship issues, which were definitely something that I experienced. So we're talking about that emotional disconnect or unresolved conflicts and poor communication that can really impact our sexual desire. And I think that's something that gets overlooked quite a lot.
In terms of if there's a lingering fight or something you guys haven't addressed, it's kind of hanging over you like a cloud, and that impacts how you're able to connect and have desire for each other.
Yeah, because it blocks that intimacy and that connection. And what I mean by that is if you have a disagreement and you really don't get to a conclusion, or you don't come back to connection after that conflict, it leaves this essentially like an emotional open loop. And I think that starts to erode that ability. In particular, I notice with women and for me, where I start to not feel quite comfortable and safe to really stay open and vulnerable in the space because of this conflict. And I think it's really important to close that loop so that we can then feel calm and safe again to be able to lean into that connection and that intimacy with our partner.
So women need to feel safe, whereas men are probably more wired to separate that from intimacy. They're still able to be intimate without resolving the argument.
I've been in relationships before where my partner also was not open to intimacy if there wasn't that resolution. And that for some people can be, a couple of hours, but often it can be a couple of days. And that's, each person is individual to that. And that can be, it can be really challenging because even though you may have lent into resolution, it still may take some time for people to feel comfortable to lean into intimacy again. And if there's, every couple of days a disagreement, that can pile up and then end up impacting your libido for an extended period of time. So it's just really important for us to be aware that it can impact people differently. But what I notice in the clients that I work with is, yes, women in particular need to feel safe and calm in order to open themselves up to wanting to be close and connected to their partner on a sexual level.
Sure. So would you say that there's more clients feeling it's a psychological thing rather than a physical thing?
I do want to touch on the emotional a little bit more, and then there is also psychological factors as well. Okay. So this is where they kind of overlap a little bit. But when we're talking about the emotional, we're talking about things like body image issues as well, and a history of any sexual abuse that hasn't been resolved. I don't personally work with clients that are in the midst of that trauma, but had they have gone and sought support for it and are in a place now where they're moving forward, then of course I can work with them. The other categories are lifestyle factors. So, technology and screen time can also be a big factor. Diet and exercise, psychological factors that you just mentioned briefly could be things like self-esteem and worthiness. So that low self-esteem and unworthy of sexual attention or pleasure can really erode that low libido. And I think as well, mismatched sexual expectations or desires can be another one that pops up quite a lot, which is like these differing needs for sex and desires that can lead to frustration and reduce the libido in one or both partners.
In terms of one partner wants more sex than the other?
Yes, and not just more sex, but different types of sex too is important to mention. Quality and quantity is something that I work with a lot of clients on. Is you'll have, I want to talk generally at the moment. Most of the time it's women coming to me saying, I just don't want to have sex anymore. And I say, okay, is it that you don't want to have sex or you don't want to have the type of sex you're having? And so her partner may be wanting to have sex more frequently and she's not feeling it. And that can often actually be because it's just the quality of the sex that they're having as opposed to the quantity.
Mentioning those four things, it really is, you need to take a holistic approach to it. So there's not going to be one quick fix, but look at your lifestyle factors, what you're eating, how you're moving, and that all plays a role.
It does. And I think when I went through low libido, and what a lot of clients that I work with do is you kind of go to blaming yourself or your body for not functioning correctly first. So we often go to the physical first. And I think around the physical being where we go to first is because we go into this problem-solving mode. And I think as well, it's the path of least resistance. I don't think we really want to go into the weeds of the emotional and the psychological if we can just fix it with a diet change or, a supplement or something like that, because then we don't need to be uncomfortable. And that was definitely where I went first before I learned this concept. But what I did realize was, even though I went on exploration of what my body was lacking in or what I was not getting enough of, is I actually realized that I wasn't connected to my body at all. And I was not connected to my gut and my heart, and everything was out of balance. I didn't have that awareness of my body, but what was actually happening was that my body was sending me a message, and yet I was there hating my body for being shut down, and I was blaming it for creating problems in the relationship, which was really interesting.
So what steps did you take to reconnect?
When I realized that I wasn't trusting the signs and signals that my body was sending me, I realized that there was conflict in the relationship, and what was happening was my partner was being triggered by his insecurities were being triggered because I had low libido and I wasn't having that much desire for sex. And what that would create is more conflict. And so he would feel like he wasn't good enough. And then we would have a disagreement, and it would be awkward, and we'd have this tension around not having sex or around having low libido. And then for me, my body was shut down because of the lack of conflict resolution. And then it was creating more conflict. So it was like I was on this hamster wheel. But it basically got to a point where my body was sending me these signals because it wasn't the right person. And that's not always the case. But what I do say to clients is I can understand, because our bodies send us signals, and it doesn't mean it's the wrong person, but it's telling us something that we need to listen to or pay attention to. And it might be that you're not speaking up for what you want. It might be that you're resenting your partner for something. It might be that they're not treating you in a way that you want to be treated, or you don't even know yourself or what brings you pleasure or creates desire. So it might be your body telling you it's time to actually start working out what that is. So the body is really cool like that. It will send us a message when we're out of balance or something's not right. And for me, the relationship wasn't right. So when I was able to see that and leave the relationship, within 2 weeks, my libido came back.
Wow. In terms of communicating to your partner, if you are experiencing low libido and you don't want them to feel triggered that they're not enough, is there a good way to communicate that? That's
so interesting to say that, because that's exactly how I felt when I was with another partner who was experiencing low libido. And both very different situations. And I'm sure the universe had an intention to put me through it so that I could understand it to be able to serve my clients. But it was really triggering. And the way I look at it is, for me, it was actually highlighting to me that there was a part of me that really needed to be looked at. And what I realized through that process was there was still a message for me that I needed to see around needing external validation. And when I wasn't desired sexually, or when my partner didn't want intimacy because of whatever reason, it was triggering this part of me that my identity had been around being externally validated. And so what I realized was that there was so much more to me that I needed to look at and feel a deep sense of love. That wasn't just about this external validation or it being sexualized or, defined by desirability. So this is, essentially my mindset around this, and what I help my clients with is this is about what is really underneath all of it. Whilst we can sit there and try and diagnose and fix the problem of low libido, what is the opportunity here? Well, it's to change the identity around the situation. And it was an opportunity for me to go, okay, this is just needing to lean into love and change this programming of what was coming up. And so I guess the process in that is we look at this situation as being personal, and this is what we default into. It's like, well, they just don't want to be with me, or I'm not desirable enough, or this is a representation of who I am. And we attach our identity to it. But I think that actually perpetuates the problem. And I think when we can actually hold space for our partner and just really try not to take these situations as being directly personal to us, it's such an opportunity for that relationship to go to a level that is so much deeper and emotionally connected. And it is really uncomfortable. I get it. In fact, for me, it was more uncomfortable being on the receiving end of low libido than being the person that was frustrated with my body and not knowing the answers, because I felt out of control. But really, when I told myself, no, this is an opportunity to love yourself deeper, that's when I felt that shift in the dynamic and creating that safety for my partner to do what he needed to do in order to move through it actually created a better relationship.
Relationships are just one big mirror, aren't they? And it showed you something that you need to work on. It is so easy to fall into the trap of, I guess, being the victim and feeling like you're not enough in that situation. But the way you were able to look at what needs healing within you took the pressure off your partner, so he was able to come out of it naturally himself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is challenging. I'm not going to play that down at any point. But when we shift our mindset, that what can happen is just, that's the beautiful thing that I love to see with clients is like, okay, whilst this feels like there's no resolution, if we start to really switch up how we view things, we actually have the potential to take this relationship in a completely different direction.
It's almost taking extreme responsibility, isn't it? With movement, would you encourage people, if they're trying to reclaim their sexual power, would you encourage women in particular to get into some movement that sort of embraces their feminine side?
It's really exclusive to the individual, but I do strongly believe that physical activity can boost your libido, and it can also improve your body image, which is something we haven't really touched on. And I think that's really important. I think how we view ourselves is a large contributor to libido as well. And as well as, the physical activity can also reduce stress. So as I'm sure most people know, when we're exercising, it releases endorphin, serotonin, and dopamine. And these things can all have positive impacts on our, our brain and our mood, and our overall happiness. But what that looks like for the individual can be really unique. I know for me, I love all different types of exercise, and I know you're a runner. I think you do a little bit of running. So me, that's my sweet spot. That's what really brings that release of the positive chemicals in my body and makes me feel really, really good. For other people, that might be yoga. That might be something super slow. My approach is always with clients, head into it with a mindset of curiosity, start to explore what actually does that for you, because that can look different for everyone. But I think it's really important to find what brings you into alignment with your authenticity. So for me, I love the marathon running, but then I also love the concept of dance, because that brings me back into my femininity as well. And it's not at all something I'm good at. And I think that's what people think. And I've had a lot of people say to me about running, oh my God, you're so good at running. And I'm like, yeah, but I didn't start here.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't born good at running. I've worked my butt off to get where I am. And it's the same with dance. And it's the same with yoga and Pilates. You just have to find something that has that impact on you, that makes you feel yourself. And then you're going to get the benefits from it. But if you approach it with curiosity and exploration, then I think you're going to be able to identify what works for you best.
What works really well for me is the sauna and ice bath combination. There's something about the sauna in just overcoming those demons when you're sweating it out. It's so hot, it's so painful. Jump in the ice bath. You come out of that feeling so good and invigorated. And for me, it definitely boosts libido and just vitality.
Absolutely. For me, I notice what it is. So I notice that feeling when I get goosebumps. And what I mean by that is, on your body, you just like get that rush. That's when I know that something is really is having a positive impact on me. And even if I'm running, a half marathon and I'm like 12 Ks in and I get goosebumps, I'm like, it doesn't, physically match up, but I know that my body is thriving and it feels really good. And I think that's a good indicator. Hard to tell with an ice bath and a sauna, I think, with the goosebumps.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good indicator for me.
You mentioned, we talked about mismatch in expectations around sex. If a couple were to come to you and say, oh, look, we're having sex less, but, my partner says, we're just getting older. It's natural. We've got kids now where it's just a natural part of life. That's how it goes. Is that a valid argument? What would you say to that?
The key word with all of this is, natural, not normal. And I think we often use what we see and hear other people doing as a yardstick to measure if something is normal or not normal. So obviously long-term relationships can be different. When we're thinking long-term relationships, it takes effort and time to put into nurturing that relationship, and that includes intimacy and sex. And I think it really does come down to that. I think it comes down to, I remember hearing your podcast with Thomas, and when you were talking about, putting the time and effort in, and he was talking about the long distance relationship and how they had that date planned every week. Absolutely vital for a thriving relationship, and maybe intimacy dates, but also sex dates. And I think we can look at it as being like, oh, it's scheduled and it's, lame and whatever, but it's how we approach it, and still keeping it a little bit fun and spontaneous, but looking at these commitments in our relationship as being something that is adding and a way to nurture and show respect for the relationship, to keep that consistency going so that we don't let things like, sex fall off the bandwagon or not be a priority. It might not be as easy to maintain our sex life as things go on, but I think if you put the time and effort into it, it can be even better than when you first started. But if you're approaching it with a curious mindset and not assuming that the way that your partner wanted pleasure in the beginning of the relationship, it's still the way they want pleasure 10 years in, then you probably need to change your mindset.
I love that, because like we were saying before, approaching these things with curiosity, working out what gives you goosebumps. In a relationship, I guess the tendency is to wait until you're both horny to have sex. But what if you did schedule a session where you're like, okay, let's work out what turns each other on. Let's spend half an hour trying these new things and take away some of the heaviness that, we all attach to sex sometimes, and just approach it with a really curious mind.
Absolutely. I would love to share something with you. Just when we're talking about this exploration, I think a really cool technique is a way to create some more sensuality in our relationships and heightening our senses, because, that is essentially sensuality. We're tapping into these senses. And a good way to keep things exciting is doing things by setting a date and maybe removing sight, so you can use a blindfold. That's when it can come into play. And I think the reason that I would suggest to lean into removing sight is because it's the strongest sense, and it's often considered to be a large part of why of the brain being dedicated to processing visual information. So when we're able to remove sight, we're able to enhance intimacy and sensuality in a relationship by encouraging our partners to focus on other senses, to deepen this emotional connection that isn't just visual. And I think some ways to do that, I always recommend to try with yourself or with your partner, is to be a tourist, not a tour guide. I guess the mindset is the difference between couples that thrive in intimacy coaching and couples that find it really challenging. And so when we're talking about using blindfolds during these intimate moments, we can look at this as a way of heightening other senses like touch. And I would suggest taking it in turns to do the blindfolding. But what is really important is to create a safe space. So when you don't have visual cues, you've got every touch, caress, whisper can become more intense and focused. And this can lead partners to be more mindful and present when they're paying closer attention to these other sensations and the responses of their partner.
We've got some great practical tips here. Book a sex date, try a blindfold and remove some of those senses.
And you can do it with all of the different senses. You know, you can engage the senses of taste by, you know, sharing different foods and flavors. You know, this is why strawberries and chocolate are great, or oysters if that's your jam. But you're essentially trying to activate other senses because we rely so much on our sight.
So lots of people are working from home these days, and I was just thinking for those couples who are always in each other's pockets, who spend a lot of time together, what advice would you have for them? I guess the sex date or planning something different to break routine would be a good start for them.
I had a partner where we both worked from home, and that was a lot. You spend the whole day basically in the vicinity of each other whilst you're not actually spending time together. You're still in the same space. And that can be really hard. I think something I always advocate for is to be able to create some space to have some time alone and have your own independence. I think that's really important. And even taking yourself out of the environment as much as possible. I think that is what I've seen to be a really powerful way to create desire and longing for your partner, is to be able to create some physical distance between you, so that you can then build that up and come back together. So I see a lot of benefit in finding ways that you can actually create that distance apart. And even if that is just taking yourself out for a walk, you know, for an hour or something like that, or a holiday, even better. But to create that distance between you is actually what also builds the desire and the longing and the connection too.
Yeah, just a circuit breaker to create that tension again.
Absolutely, yeah.
What if, in terms of approaching these sensitive topics with our loved one, what if the conversations just make it worse and the partner doesn't respond well and they don't want to rock the boat? Surely they can just, you know, do the washing or give a massage and it'll fix itself, right?
I think a key point, and which is often overlooked when we're talking about intimacy, you really need to choose the right time and place. And something that I am so guilty of is when you're, let's say, for example, you're in a relationship where there's some low libido, you might have instigated something with your partner, let's say in the bedroom, and they've turned around and said, no, I'm just not feeling it or whatever. You then initiate the conversation then and there in the bedroom, in the midst of, I guess, essentially the heat of the moment. That escalates the situation rapidly, and it can be a really, I guess, not a healthy way to go about it. It's really hard not to, I get it, but you're really emotionally charged and it can often lead to defensiveness or hurt feelings. And I think for the person who feels rejected, but then also for the person that's experiencing probably frustration within their body of what's going on, I think it can be quite damaging, and it can exacerbate the situation more than it needs to be. Another really important point is to lead with empathy. And I think by expressing your understanding and care, and we spoke about this before, taking your own personal experience out of the equation and actually hearing what your partner's saying without making it about you is so powerful for these conversations, in particular when it gets a bit awkward and uncomfortable. And then using I statements to express your feelings without placing any blame. Also, what I've also been guilty of is making assumptions about their feelings or reasons for having low libido. I think if we haven't been in it before, we can take it really personally and think that maybe we're not attractive anymore, or maybe we're not doing it for our partner, or they just don't think we're hot anymore or something like that. We're making all of these assumptions about the situation without actually asking questions.
So take conflict out of the bedroom, use that nonviolent communication, try and understand their situation, and realize that it is usually a holistic thing, whether it's stress or diet or a whole range of issues that might be causing it. It's probably not you.
We did touch on it before, but for me, the best thing about all of this was it just showed me that there was an opportunity for more growth. Yeah. It showed me that there was clearly some triggers coming up around needing external validation from my partner and, looking at this situation as defining my attractiveness when really that was my shit. That was my story in my head and that wasn't the case. And so instead of putting my energy into the relationship and the problems in the relationship, I've harnessed that energy into self-reflection and how I could create more love for myself. And in combination with that, which I haven't mentioned, is I slipped into a pattern of relying on my partner to give me pleasure instead of my own self-pleasure. And so when I started to lean back into self-pleasure, which is really taboo in general, let alone in a relationship, I think we just think when we've got a partner, we don't need to self-pleasure. I think it's a really interesting and cool approach in these cases of low libido that you can look at it as an opportunity to connect with yourself and find new ways of bringing yourself pleasure. It also does sometimes take the edge off. And so if we're in this frustration where we haven't had sex with our partner for a considerable amount of time, that drastically exacerbates our feelings and emotions of frustration. So if we're able to go into our own body and self-pleasure, we're actually taking a little bit of the edge off in the temporary situation that we're in, because we can't just leave it and not deal with it. But it is a good way of developing that connection with ourselves and also reducing the frustration.
I want to share a quick story with you about sleep. This year, more than ever, my sleep has been terrible. Regularly waking up at 3 a.m., tossing and turning, not being able to get back to sleep. And the only thing that worked was actually waking up, making a cup of tea, meditating, so that when I got back to bed, my mind was clear and I could fall back to sleep again. I couldn't work out what was going wrong. I tried everything from blue light glasses, nose strips, mouth strips, all the supplements I could take before bed. I was making sure that I was meditating, running before I went to sleep. And it didn't matter what I did. I'd still quite often, maybe 4 times a week, wake up at 3 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep. So when I received an offer from 8 Sleep to try out their new Pod 4, I was little skeptical, but really keen to try something that was potentially going to fix my sleep. And I mean this honestly from the bottom of my heart. Nothing has been as transformational as the Pod 4 has been to my sleep. I am now consistently sleeping through the night. I no longer stress about sleep. I'm getting deep sleep. My heart rate is dropping. And now I look forward to going to sleep. The way it works, it's basically a mattress cover that circulates hot and cold water to regulate your temperature throughout the night. You can control both sides of the bed independently, which is great because Zoe runs hot and I run cold. And the biggest revelation for me is that the reason I was waking up is because my mattress and the bed was getting too hot. It was waking me up and I couldn't get back to sleep before my body temperature dropped. With the 8 Sleep, it makes sure that it's cool throughout the night. And it's not cold, it's quite subtle, but it just prevents that mattress from overheating and from me overheating and from me waking up, and I honestly cannot speak highly enough. It is expensive. That's the elephant in the room. It's not a cheap product, but I take this role very seriously in recommending products, and knowing that it is an investment, I truly think that investing in your sleep is a really wise thing to do because it's going to pay dividends in your lifestyle, in your relationships, and in your work. So thank you, 8 Sleep, for sponsoring this episode. And if you'd like to give them a go, they offer a 30-night risk-free trial. Now back to Chloe.
I do really want to share with people is a couple of examples of how to approach these conversations with your partner, because we're not taught how to have these conversations. And we're not really even taught how to communicate with our partner. That's something we learn as we go on. But in particular, when we're talking about intimacy, because it's still a very taboo topic. So I've got a couple of script examples that I'd love to share with your listeners if you think that would be beneficial.
That'd be fantastic.
So if we're looking at initiating maybe like a gentle conversation about intimacy, so you could say something like, I've been feeling like we've had less intimate time together lately and I miss being really close to you. I want us to both feel comfortable and connected. Maybe we could talk about what we both need right now. It's important to me that we feel good about our intimacy. So that's nice and light. That's still sharing your feelings about something that you'd like to maybe discuss. And it's not confrontational either.
It's using that I language, isn't it? Taking responsibility.
Yeah. It's also showing interest in connection. And I think that's what we all really seek here, is that connection with our partner. And that's, can be quite triggering when we don't feel connected because we haven't had sex or intimacy. That can be hard. So I think it's about leaning into it in a positive frame. I think as well, if you're feeling you're at a point where you want to consider some support as well, a good script for that could be if you're feeling pressure or stress about our intimate life, I really want to help alleviate that. Maybe we could try some new things together, or maybe have a conversation with somebody that could support us in our journey to be able to have a more relaxed dynamic in our intimacy that's enjoyable. What are your thoughts on this? And I think when we're putting it back on them as an open-ended question for them to share how they feel about it, it shows that we're interested in hearing their opinion. And I think we're not doing it in a way that's like, oh, we need to go and see somebody. Well, this isn't working for me. I think when we're leaning into it in a soft way, it can help de-armor our partner and allow them to look at it as a way to have deeper connection and a more connected feeling in the relationship, as opposed to there being a problem needing a solution.
For men, giving men the chance to improve something, which I think we innately like to do. So instead of making this huge problem, present an opportunity just to fine-tune things and increase the sex life, which I'm sure most men would like to do.
Yeah. And that's the thing, the way that it starts, as our relationship does, so does our sex and intimate life. The way we start our relationship, not everyone can relate, but I think most people can, is you have that spark and that chemistry and that connection. And whether you have sex or not in the beginning, I don't think that's relevant, but because you haven't formed that deep bond and that love and that connection with each other, the way you view it can also shift. And so as we go on, what we decide in the beginning might be the hot and heavy, but then we might want to make love as time goes on and lean into a deeper level of sex or a different type of sex. And that evolves all the time, just like how we do on a daily basis as humans. So does our desires and our needs and our wants. And so when we have somebody on the sidelines supporting us, I think that's really a great way to set the relationship up for success without looking at it as being, an intimacy coach being somebody that is just there to fix a problem in their sex life.
You're right. Just that transition from the early stages, the honeymoon period, into the more companionate stages of love. We just do it silently, I guess. You don't really talk about that with your partner. And just having those conversations means you're able to do it more consciously.
Something I love to highlight as well is that, we have movies and porn as a reference point, but we also have our friends' relationships where most of the time we actually don't get the truth because people only really want to share the highlight reels and the positive stuff like they do on social media. So we're comparing our relationships and our sex life to the unknown. And I think when we're talking about, having an intimacy coach or somebody in your corner, is normalizing that it's okay to go through these stages and changes in intimacy and sex and what that actually means. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means that you're navigating a new path. And that's not something that a lot of people talk to, with people close to them about, because it leaves them very open and vulnerable. And it's not welcome to talk about challenges in sex and intimacy as much as I would hope it can be in the future.
Yeah. Our happiness is so closely tied to our expectations of things. And so many of us haven't clearly defined our expectations around sex, especially with our partner. And like you were saying, we need to base our expectations based on what's realistic in our life. And if someone's really busy with 3 kids, their expectations need to be a little bit lower. And if they can have that conversation with their partner, and once they reach that low expectation, they'll be happy, and that stress will be diminished.
Yeah, I think everyone's desires and expectations are different. And I think I love that you highlighted about kids, because a lot of women go through a bit of a change in their identity and what they want and what they need from their relationship when kids come into play too. Not always. And it can go one way or the other. There's no right or wrong, but it can shift. We go through these different stages of life, and we need to adapt our intimacy and our sex to that as well. We need to look at it and allow it to be fluid and forever evolving, and change our perspective on sex, which is, I could talk all day about how porn influences that and how what we see in media influences our sex life. But I think what we really need to do is find what works for us and come back to ourselves and find, what's pleasurable and enjoyable and fills my cup personally, and also for my partner as well.
What is your advice for women who have just had kids and they're suffering from low libido or just feeling different?
Yeah, look, I'd love to share a story with you. I had a client, so she had a couple of kids, and this was quite a few years after she'd had kids. But I think this came about because of the change in her relationship and them not reevaluating their intimacy and those dynamics after kids, and just having this expectation that it was still going to be the same, or that they were trying to achieve the same dynamic, but with a very different home environment. So she came to me with basically no libido or sex drive, and she was still actually having sex with her partner, but essentially it was just an item on her to-do list. And it really wasn't bringing her any sexual satisfaction or joy at all. And so I asked the question about self-pleasure, and I said, "Are you self-pleasuring?" And she said that she believed that any desire that she had, she should give to her husband and her sex life, because she was carrying this feeling of owing sex to her partner because she felt guilty that she didn't have desire for sex. And she knew that sex is an important part of the relationship. So for most of our journey together, we spent actually rebuilding her self-confidence and her connection with who she is. Any shame or any beliefs that were not serving her around intimacy and sexuality. And a lot of the time when I do work with just a client, it is about establishing that love and connection and intimacy with yourself first. And what can happen is it can beautifully evolve into the relationship without actually directly doing anything to the relationship. It can be when we reestablish this love and connection and confidence within ourselves, the relationship is impacted just by default. That's just how it happens. So we talked about rebuilding her confidence and her self-love, and she went and actioned that. And there was some beautiful shifts for her. And she gave herself permission to experience self-pleasure. And so when she started to incorporate the self-pleasure into her life, she actually found that it increased her libido, because I think she was under this impression that we have this quota, like a libido quota, where if we only have a little bit of a desire or no desire at all, we're going to use it up. And what happens with self-pleasure, and when we have this, we find ways to pleasure ourselves, is it's like a snowball effect. The more pleasure we have, the more pleasure we want. And it actually often activates that desire within ourselves.
The first thing that comes to mind for me, I guess we have to differentiate between self-pleasure and watching porn, because it sounds like you're not a fan of how porn is conditioning us in relationships. So how would you advise clients around porn and self-pleasure?
I'd love to talk to the impact of porn and OnlyFans on relationships, firstly, And look, I'm not against it. I just think that there's some things that are impacting us overall, and in particular with younger people as well. And I think what I'm noticing in relationships is it's setting us up for these unrealistic expectations. And I think when we have such easy access to porn and platforms like OnlyFans, it has exposed young people in particular to, I guess, this highly stylized and often unrealistic portrayals of sexuality. And of course, these platforms can provide a form of sexual expression and freedom, which I'm a huge advocate for, but they also present a very skewed view of sex that really does emphasize physicality over the emotional connection. And I think that's where, for me, it doesn't sit right with porn, is that there's this view on sex as being physical, and that we're missing this piece of this emotional connection. And so there's this increasing focus on sexualization and less focus on the emotional and relational aspects of intimacy. And I think this can lead to this disconnect in the relationship where the physical acts are actually split from the emotional engagement, which makes sex feel really performative and a lot less satisfying. And I think that's what we're seeing in porn, is like you don't often see the emotional connection, if at all, as well as the comparison and insecurity. And I think when we're constantly exposed to a very, very small niche of physical views of what women look like, which is often very skewed, it's only a very small portion of women that look the way that porn stars look, it can lead to these dangerous comparisons and feelings of insecurity, which can really reduce our libido. And not even just for women comparing themselves to other women, but I'm talking like men comparing women to other women, if that's their reference point. So it becomes very difficult for men to then get aroused by women in the world, because most people don't look like porn stars.
And they haven't been photoshopped.
Absolutely. And I understand why the industry does it. It's because that's what is the most clicked on. That is what is getting the most traction, but it's not serving. And it's actually perpetuating the problem and making for this need for perfection to actually hinder the connection that we want, as well as the sex. It's like blending the worlds together.
An interesting point about performance, where I guess you'd be seeing a massive link between people watching porn and women feeling like they have to perform in the bedroom rather than connecting with what feels good for them.
It's interesting you say that, because before I got into this space, I actually didn't realize that's what I was doing. And I don't think many women are. I don't think we realize that we're playing a role or performing or showing up in sex in a certain way. I just don't think we know that we're doing that. And yet I think a lot of people are. I think we, again, come back to our reference point of being, let's say movies now, for example, where you see women, a man might come rushing through the door and like throw her up against the wall, and like 30 seconds later she orgasms. And you're like, she's moaning and making all of this noise. And you're like, okay, what about foreplay? What about like other forms of, oral sex or things like that? And, most women can't orgasm from sex. And not only that, but not in 30 seconds. Yeah. No, like we're talking on average 20 minutes. And you definitely don't see that in movies. So I think when we feel like we're not meeting a standard or we're not up to scratch, we then go, I don't want to feel abnormal. And that's where it becomes dangerous for women. And what I, like you said, work with women on is like, you know what? It's actually normal. It's actually okay and common for you to not orgasm that quickly. And you know what? The best thing we can do for not only other women, but also men, is to stop pretending. If we genuinely don't enjoy something, or it genuinely takes us a long time. It's like finding that courage and comfort within ourselves to be honest, not just with ourselves, but also with the other person in the room, because otherwise we're just playing into this performance and we're not actually enjoying sex and pleasure. And then this is where the libido can come into the mix. It's like, well, if you're not enjoying sex, then why the hell would you want to have sex?
Especially if it's affecting your self-worth and you're not feeling like you're meeting those unrealistic expectations. And that's how we go full circle back to what we were talking at the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all intertwined, and it's just about understanding it on a deeper level. And I'm not sure how old you are, but I know that when I was at school, we didn't have, any conversations about pleasure. It was all about abstinence and, STI and STD prevention. So, we weren't taught. And that's what I'm so passionate about now is, in intimacy coaching, that doesn't need to be people with problems. It's just around normalizing conversations about being your authentic self and feeling comfortable to speak up for what you want.
The scary lessons we did get at school around STIs and abstinence for women, I guess that would bring a lot of shame to a lot of women and clients of yours. Is there a way for them to harness that shame, or how do they work through that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. What I've noticed, and I didn't actually expect when I first started in this space, was, we first have to uncover where the shames come from. And it's not often us, it's often somebody else. But religion actually plays a big part, which was something that I didn't expect. And that's interesting because, again, we're coming back to curiosity. But that's the approach I would take is, okay, cool. So we feel shame. Okay. And it's a horrible feeling to feel shame. Even I have experienced shame because there wasn't an open platform for us to have conversations about sex in the household. That just wasn't a thing. But if we understand it and we approach it with curiosity and we don't judge it, we can start to understand where it's come from and then go, okay, interesting, that's not my story. And what is my story moving forward? How do I feel about it? And I think when we're also working on self-esteem and confidence, they come together. So when we're feeling confident within ourselves, we can own that sexual and sensual part of ourselves at the same time. But we have to be able to have that connection with ourselves in order to release the shame and to be able to step into who we really are and know who that is without worrying about other people's opinions and thoughts. Doesn't mean we have to shout it from the rooftops and be this sexually liberated goddess. But if we know ourselves and we feel comfortable with our story and we create our own story, then we set ourselves up for having a beautiful relationship with sex and intimacy.
Do any client breakthroughs stand out for you? Any success stories that you can talk to?
I want to come back to that story I just shared with you, and I think it's an important one. This is the story just around how we put other people's needs and desires above ourselves. And I think majority of the clients I have will come to me when they're putting everyone else in their household before themselves, and they're essentially allowing their partner's needs to be more important than their own. And this has come back to this, people-pleasing kind of mentality where we're quite happy to put the oxygen mask on everyone else before ourselves. And I think as much as we feel like in that space, we're doing a service to other people, we're actually doing a complete disservice to other people and ourselves. And so even though this isn't a specific story, I think it goes across the board and so many people could relate to it, is we really, really need to focus on filling up our own cup first. We really need to focus on finding things that bring us pleasure, that light us up and that bring us joy in our lives, and loving ourselves first. And every time that clients have lent into that and prioritized themselves and started to find ways to form a different relationship with themselves, that everything else starts to flow beautifully as well. And I think that's, for me, has been so rewarding in this space. And has had the biggest impact on my clients overall.
Thank you so much for coming on. Where can clients find you? Are you working with clients at the moment, or where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I do still have a couple of spots open for the rest of the year. So clients can find me on Instagram at thehoneyed.official, or on my website to find out more information, www.honey-ed.com. Or as we were speaking about just before, Nick, I've just recently launched a podcast, which would be a cool place for people to go and have a listen and get to know me a little bit better. And that podcast is called Honey Ed Intimacy Made Easy.
I had a listen. They're really great episodes because they're 20 minutes long and it's just packed full of information. So you get bite-sized bits of knowledge that I feel like with the podcast, that's just a perfect length. And I'm trying to reduce mine a little bit with that in mind because, people don't always have 90 minutes to listen to something. So put it in your car, listen to Honey Ed. And Chloe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Nick.